Hello, I'm recording this because I recently had a extended conversation with a number of members of the Gauntlet community over the subject of oral traditions and games, especially tabletop RPGs, and whether or not the availability of online video and audio changes how we should think about um, the involvement of non-written media in how we communicate game concepts and what we consider to be the text of a game. So this was mainly inspired by my listening to the Improbable Interviews video with John Harper. So you can check that out. I'll have the link in the show notes. Um, and and also my experience, over the last year trying to understand Blades in the Dark, trying to communicate its concepts in a not strictly textual way with my Let's Learn Blades in the Dark series, right? I've recorded a long video tutorial series where I explain with my voice and with text on the screen how the rules of Blades in the Dark work. I followed that up with my review series of Blades in the Dark, where I've tried to talk about some of the difficulties of learning and running the game. And this has all really been towards the end of understanding what the game does and how I can communicate that to other people. And what I found was in listening to first the narrative control interview with John Harper about Blades in the Dark, and then the Improbable Interviews interview with John Harper about Blades in the Dark. What I found in those interviews is I learned a lot about the game and what it really was intended to do, and what its fundamental concepts and orientation were, in a way that I was really not able to grasp from the text. So there's really two ways I could think about this problem. One is that I'm a bad reader, right? I'm a bad reader, so I didn't understand what the text was trying to say, even though it's obvious. Another is that the text is a bad text. It doesn't communicate its concepts well. Another thought that I had was that maybe writing these concepts down and communicating them in text is very difficult. And the reason why I thought this was because Blades in the Dark is a game that was in development for a very long time, and it was not a solo project. It was a project that was developed with the help of many playtesters who were experienced RPG players. It had contributing writers, and it also had the support and contributions of members of Evil Hat, the publisher, both in terms of product development and also in terms of editing. There was an extensive editing process on the game in a way that many indie games are not able to enjoy. And so, even in the interview with John Harper, he talks a lot about how there were a lot of hard decisions that had to be made in writing the text and trying to communicate its concepts to the reader, and how different strategies for presenting the text had different advantages and disadvantages. This was compared in the interview to the advantages and disadvantages of various layouts that can be used in UX design, in user experience design, right? So some UXs are good for some things, and other UXs are good for other things. So, for example, if you think about a command line interface, like a Unix command line, which is a purely text-based way to interface with a computer, it has certain advantages in that there's only one way to interact with the computer, which is by the insertion of text, the editing of text, which simplifies and speeds up the interaction with the computer in some ways, and also grants a knowledgeable user a lot of power, the ability to insert very complex commands that can be processed in a batch. There's many advantages to using a command line. Another advantage is you don't have to use a mouse, which means you do not get carpal tunnel syndrome from moving a mouse around. There's plenty of advantages to that UX. What about, say, a graphical user interface in the style of Windows, right? Windows with a start menu at the bottom, graphical file manager, all that kind of thing. Well, that communicates some concepts to the reader, or sorry, to the user, in a different way, right? Instead of having a list of items, it has a representation of icons on the screen, and that can help the user make sense of what they're seeing. It also allows them to interact with the computer without using a lot of arcane commands. So it can be easier to get into that style of computing. The same could be said for smartphone interfaces. Those have benefits and disadvantages relative to a graphical user interface or a command line interface. What I'm saying is that every UX has advantages and disadvantages, and this is no less true of how a game text is designed. And I think that the game text design of Blades in the Dark is designed in such a way that it foregrounds the game concepts, the rule concepts, and it backgrounds certain genre assumptions or certain touchstones or key game concepts at the level of the fiction relative to the rules. It foregrounds the rules a lot. It foregrounds how to play and run the game a lot. And the intent here with that design choice was to encourage new players to be onboarded as active participants in the game and to have a grasp of concepts that would otherwise perhaps be assigned only to the GM to be learned. And that's important because Blades in the Dark is designed in such a way that players are supposed to take responsibility for how the game is run in a way that they're not in many other RPGs. This is a thing I've already talked about in my review. So in that sense, the design choices made sense. They were good design choices. But what I really found to be a challenge is, like, in reading the text, I really had a hard time understanding, like, what is this game about? What are its key touchstones? What are the fundamental principles that I need to take into play in order to create a fictional world and experience that is in harmony with the intent, the design intent of the game? And this is something that I don't normally have a huge problem with games. So in the case of PBTA games, I think they have a lot of principles, and the moves are written in such a way that they communicate these things fairly well. And yet, I question to what extent that is just because I have immersed myself in the culture of PBTA games for years, a couple of years now, and I have been introduced into a conversation about those games, which is only beginning in the case of games based on Blades in the Dark, or Blades in the Dark itself. And this is what brings me to this question of the oral component of tabletop role-playing games. In the beginning of the hobby, there was a very significant component of it that was based on oral transmission of play conventions, game concepts, and sort of heuristics like rules of thumb for how to play the game. There was a lot of neglect of the importance of writing down clear rules because it was assumed that anyone who wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons or one of the other very early tabletop RPGs would know somebody who would be able to introduce them to the game, right? They would know a GM who could induct them into the inner circle of players. And this worked to a degree for the first generation of players. However, there was a major problem, and this is something John Harper talked about in his interview, for the next generation of players who were too young to be accepted at the table in those early groups where there were now adults running the games, and they didn't want kids joining and being inducted into those oral traditions. So they were gatekeeping, they were keeping the kids out, and the kids were forced to just go on the written rules, which were not really given the attention that they might have otherwise been due because they were supplemented by the oral tradition. And so this led to a lot of frustration, and it led to the next generation of tabletop RPGs writers really focusing on improving the quality of text writing. They wanted to write better RPG texts with the intent that they could make tabletop RPGs exoteric, that they could make them easily understood by any person with, a reasonable reading level and some level of social skills and reasoning skills. So that led to a lot of better game texts because people were focused on the quality of writing. And that's good. That's great. That's great. But I would argue that they were not successful in their goal. They did not actually achieve what they set out to achieve. They got some of the way there. So, maybe in a... We can view textual completeness and exoteric game writing as a kind of regulative principle in the Kantian sense. We are ever approaching it. We never reach it, but it is our guiding star that as RPG creators, we need to constantly orient ourselves towards, right? It recedes ever towards the horizon, and yet we continue to try to get closer and closer to it. We continue to invest all of our energy and our efforts to writing texts that are as clear as possible and can be picked up, read, and played as is without any reference to an outside conversation. I am not so sure I agree with that. And this is based on a couple of things. In the first case, it's based on my experience with Blades in the Dark, where I don't think John Harper is a bad writer. I don't think that he had bad editors. I don't think that Blades in the Dark is a poorly written text. I think that it has its limitations, it has its mistakes. You know, it could do with a second edition somewhere down the road. It could be improved. But I think that as John Harper said in his interview, the decisions that were made in writing the text were made with a consciousness of how some layouts and writing decisions could privilege some goals over others. It was made with an intent and an understanding that choices were being made. Right? There's only so many pages, and after a certain page count, you start to lose the reader anyway. So you have to make smart decisions, conscious decisions, intentional decisions over how you lay out a game and what you include in it. I think that there was a serious effort over many years made in order to make a good game in that sense. But I think that it's obviously been very successful in some sense, right? Because the rule system that is there has inspired a great deal of interest and has inspired a great deal of activity over hacking the game. But I have seen at the table that there are persistent problems that exist, and there are persistent questions that I had about the game that I was never really able to overcome until I looked outside of the text. And as somebody who has been a student for most of their life, and who has, you know, I was a student in the humanities, I was taught close reading techniques, I spent a great deal of time trying to become a good reader, and I tried to use my skills as a reader to help others understand this game. As somebody in that position, it's very frustrating to me that I put so much effort and I put all of the skills that I had at my disposal into reading the text and understanding what it had to say, and yet I was completely in the dark about so many important game concepts that were transmitted to me in a matter of minutes by simply listening to a casual conversation that John Harper had with some interviewers. That is deeply frustrating to me. And this is something that I don't think is exclusive to tabletop RPGs. It also goes back to my experiences in academia. I spent most of my time in my doctoral program completely isolated from the broader scholarly community. I was in a very small program. I did not interact with my advisor very frequently, and I spent a lot of time in solitary reading practice. And I was moving from one discipline where I had been trained within the context of an oral tradition, which was communications. I had actually gone to many seminars, and I had been inducted into the oral tradition of that discipline through listening and conversing with others. And I was going into a discipline where I was an outsider. I was studying the history of economics, and I was an outsider both in terms of history and in terms of economics. I did not have a great deal of induction into the oral traditions of those disciplines. And what I found was that I could spend a great deal of effort studying the key texts of the discipline, and I could enter into a conversation at a conference or some other, broader social setting. And I could be respected and heard for what I had studied and the effort I had put into to reading the material. However, I was not able to successfully participate in the broader conversation, the practice of the discipline. I had a limited field of expertise that was not supplemented by the broader conventions and tacit understandings of that discipline. And this is something that's very common for autodidacts, like people who teach themselves something. They are shut out of the broader culture of a discipline, of something that people put a lot of time and energy and professional commitment into, because they only have a certain kind of specialist, obvious, exoteric knowledge that can be gleaned from books, but they lack the background information. And so there is a intentional or unintentional gatekeeping effect that keeps them out of the discipline. And this is what everybody in tabletop RPGs who is trying to write these very clear texts is trying to fight, right? They're trying to say, no, we can get over this by writing very clear texts and have texts that are authorities for everybody to reference. So there is no, yes, it says that there, but really, we all know, us who are in this closed community all know, but that what we should actually think is something else. And you are a boor, and you are, some kind of fool for, or you're just very rude. You're very uneducated, uninitiated for suggesting something based on this text, right? Like, that's what we want to avoid. We want to avoid people being shut out. And I deeply sympathize with that, because I had that experience. I was subject to gatekeeping in a very profound way, individually, for a number of years of my life, and my career prospects were deeply damaged by my being shut out of these disciplines. So if anybody has any interest in avoiding gatekeeping, it's me. I absolutely am against that kind of behavior, and I've been trying to do things like Let's Learn Blades in the Dark in order to make this kind of hidden or difficult to access knowledge available to more people, so that they can participate as equals and enjoy something that their personal learning style or their abilities or their time limitations or their attention span keeps them from learning, right? And so I've done the best I can to try to support that. And it's very frustrating to me to see once again in this field that's not academic but still involves a lot of referencing of texts, that the skills I have in trying to do that are severely limited, and only really effective when supplemented with a broader conversation. But this is the turning point here. We can make those conversations available to people. We can, we can assume that people have read the text and then provide, on top of that, a recorded video of a conversation, say, amongst the author and the playtesters about, what are their sort of key touchstones for the game? How do they approach playing it? All of that kind of thing. We can make that available to people, and we can help them to become a part of this non-written, broader conversation. And I think that's great, because as much as there's always going to be insiders and outsiders, I think it helps a lot to have the opportunity to listen to conversations among insiders. And as much as I'd like to say that you can get there by reading a text, that's not my experience. That's not my experience in any field of my life. I've always had to refer to conversations or things outside of those core references to ever really fit in any of these cultures. And I think it's great that these closed conversations can now be opened up to other people to some degree. So my point here is that we should have game authors record some of these conversations after they've got to the end of their development process, and make those a part of the game text, right? Like, link to them in the game text or include them in the download for the game text. Don't put all of your effort into making the definitive written product, because you could be spending that effort in making a variety of texts that will be able to communicate the concepts to the reader more effectively, or to the buyer more effectively. And I just think that it's possible that text can be written to be very, very clear in communicating what they're doing and what their core concepts are and who the target audience is and how the game should be played. I think all of that can be done. However, it's very, very rare that it is successfully done. People point to Monster Hearts as a great example of a game that does this, and it's like, sure, yeah, okay, it does. But it's an outlier. If we have a means at our disposal to successfully communicate this without being a tiny percentage of all the games written, an outlier, then why don't we do that? Right? Like, why don't we take advantage of the means at our disposal now that we're not in the 1980s and we have all of these communication technologies at our disposal? Like, why don't we use those instead of saying, no, text is the text, writing is the only means of communication that is acceptable, and it has to be complete, and if you are not doing everything in your power to make a definitive statement in your text and you do not succeed, then you are a failure. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of ways to judge whether an effort to design a game is successful or not. I would like to see designers use their ingenuity and use every means at their disposal to bring games to people. And I'd like to see more games succeed in being easy to understand and easy to play. So, here's some counterpoints that people raised to my point. So one point that was raised was that art should express without demanding explanation. So meta commentary on a text should be unnecessary. And I mean, by meta commentary, what I mean is that commentary outside of the text. It should be unnecessary to play a game, right? So there's a little bit of confusion here of what is a game, right? Is it can we make a one-to-one comparison between a traditional piece of art like a novel or a painting or a sculpture and a tabletop RPG? Well, I think so. I think that's fair. I mean, there's plenty of forms of art that do not really stand without the meta commentary. For example, I mean, there's so many, right? There's representative art that does not stand without knowledge of the tradition that it's referencing, or even of the stories that it's referencing, right? So are you going to get as much out of a painting of Achilles or sculpture of Achilles if you do not know the story of the Iliad, or sorry, not the Iliad, of the story of Achilles, right? Yeah, which would in fact be the Iliad. I was getting confused with Hercules. Yes, so if you do not know the Iliad, would you get as much out of a sculpture of Achilles? Well, no, of course you would not. I mean, you would still have some valid interpretation of the art, but maybe you wouldn't enjoy it as much. Maybe you wouldn't be able to participate in a conversation about it as well. And that also goes for abstract art, right? Abstract art can reference previous works of art. You know, that's often an important way to understand abstract art, is to understand its historical context and what it was commenting on and responding to. So that's visual art. It also goes for any number of stories, right? You need a lot of reference points in order to really enjoy a story. This is an obvious thing. Like, for example, I mean, you know, a really obvious example, and probably an egregious example, would be like Ready Player One, right? It's like the gatekeepiest of stories, right? Like, it's like, I mean, you know, T.S. Eliot is pretty bad in this degree as well, but it's just a bunch of references, and if you don't understand the references, well, you're not going to get the art. And so it expresses without demanding explanation. Well, I don't know, to whom, right? Advertising is a medium or a series of media that is very much oriented towards this principle. But even then, market research is essential to advertising. You're trying to reach the broadest audience possible. In some cases, I mean, advertising has changed in the last 20, 30 years because of micro-targeting. But in the old days of advertising, say television advertising, you were trying to target the broadest possible audience. And even then, that required a certain amount of market research and understanding who you were talking to, because it's only possible for art to not demand explanation if that art is inserted into an already existing conversation with existing points of reference. And any advertiser worth their salt will know that. And they are the people who are engaged in targeting the broadest possible audience you can think of in a lot of cases. I mean, think about, think about paperback novels, the airport novel. Think about the airport novel, right? This is a type of writing that is designed to appeal to a very broad audience. So the romance novel, the Tom Clancy techno thriller, the Anne Rice horror story, which is kind of a romance novel anyway, but it's a little bit of a twist. Yes, these appeal to very simple concepts in some ways, but they're full of cultural signifiers and references without which they don't function very well. So art should express without demanding explanation. Well, again, I think that's only possible for a certain audience, and if not for them, well, then we have education for those things, right? Which is about induction into conversations and developing the skills necessary to participate in conversations. I mean, it's completely obvious to me as a teacher who has tried to teach game design to people from a different culture using a different language, that it doesn't matter what game you pick, what tabletop RPG you pick in English, any of these are going to require enormous amounts of explanation to work. And that's what localizers do, right? That's a whole industry. Adapting stories and symbols and signs and systems to the local idiom. That's what localization is about. You want to preserve the intent of the original work as you see it, but it's difficult. It's very, very difficult. Anyway, continuing. Another point that was raised against my argument. Any media product where you need to know someone who knows how to engage with it before you can engage with it is deeply flawed. And the counterexample here was video games. Video games are assumed to be very exoteric. They are very easy to engage with. They are obvious. No, they're not. They're not. As somebody who has spent an enormous amount of time in video games and listening to commentary on the video games industry, I don't think that's true. I honestly do not believe that is true. There are some video games that are very easy to understand in that sense. Nintendo is a company that tends to privilege this as a principle in their game design. It's not exclusive to all their games, but some of their games, some of their most famous games, like Super Mario Brothers, or Mario Kart. Mario Kart is probably the best example of this that Nintendo has, because the game is designed with a heavy rubber banding mechanic that can allow even a completely unskilled player to have a good time with the game. And so they can enter into a social context where other people may have more knowledge about the game, but they don't need to have lengthy explanation or induction into the game concepts in order to enjoy the game, because the game mechanics are designed in such a way, and the game interface and the user experience is designed in such a way that even someone without any skill can have a good time because of the rubber banding, because of the simplicity of inputs, and so on and so on. Many mobile games strive towards this goal, but may or may not really succeed. I think that there's a lot of still there's a lot of this needing to know someone who knows the game in order to really enjoy it that happens even in mobile games. Yes, some clicker games really don't require that, but many of the more sort of competitive games often have a certain degree of system mastery involved, and that is something that people get interested in, and they look up information on YouTube, or they talk to friends, or they look up blogs, or they go to forums, or whatever. They go to Discord. And this is an issue that is discussed all the time by people in video games as a significant problem, and how do you get around it? Like, BattleTech just came out, and people were talking about gatekeeping. People were talking about the difficulty of the game concepts and systems. Can you enjoy this game if you do not know about the BattleTech board game? These are salient conversations that people are having about these concepts. And that is not in tabletop games, that's in video games. So I think that there's a variety of games in that medium, and that's also true in tabletop RPGs. So so where do I come down on this? I think that I don't think throwing away textual completeness as a goal is what we should do, but I think that just as we think in terms of alternatives when we are designing a game text, and what the player experience goals we have, the reader experience goals we have are, and how we can best arrange the resources at our disposal in order to communicate the experience we want in the reader or the player. We should think outside of the written word as the only means we can use, the only resource at our disposal to do that. Because I think that games are moving in that direction anyways, with actual plays, with tutorial series like the one that I did, with podcasts and video podcasts of interviews. And I think it's possible for authors to engage directly with that series of options at their disposal at the level of release instead of just post-release, and make it, make these conversations very structured and clear and to the point, edited, put effort into it, do a good job of arranging it in a way that is not going to take 6 hours of the player's time in order to listen to, but put in the effort, try it, because we're putting in so much effort into these games anyway. Why not look to alternative ways of doing things? And I understand there are authors who are not confident enough to put themselves out there in a broadcast format, or who are not especially good conversationalists, or who fear the exposure that these media could give them, because of the fear of discrimination, or a hostile environment. They don't want to put themselves out there because they don't want to be subject to hostility from other people, and putting their person out there in the broadcast world is different from writing a book and putting it out there to be published. This is the dilemma of the media environment we're in now, where personality is so important. Personality-driven exposure is so important because it means that people with some skills are given advantages over others. And I understand that, and I understand why writing can be a way to express oneself without having to put oneself out there in a very vulnerable position. I'm just saying that when it comes to the question of how do we make this hobby and these games and what we love and what we're trying to make available to as many people as possible, I don't think that chasing that holy grail of the maximally exoteric text and shutting out all the alternatives for communication is the way to go. And that's my opinion. I know there are lots of people who disagree with me, but that's where I stand with this. So, yeah, if you have a agreeing opinion or a contrary opinion, you can post it down in the comments. I've said my piece, and I'm interested to see where the hobby goes from here. So thanks for listening to this. I'm extremely busy at the moment, and I think the rest of the Blades in the Dark review series will be delayed for some time. I need some more time to think about the game, but it will come out in due time, and it was never designed to be rushed to press anyway. So for those of you who are listening to that or watching it and enjoying it, thanks. It will come out in its own due time. So I will see you later with that.